February 14th, 1933. Valentine's Day. While most of New York was waking up to cold streets and broken promises, something was already in motion beneath Harlem. Something that was never meant to leave witnesses. They say history is shaped by wars, elections, and famous speeches. But sometimes history turns in places no one sees. Basements, back rooms, shadows where no cameras ever rolled. That night, one man walked into a basement, knowing he might not walk out. And 12 men walked in believing their job was already done. His name was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. At the time, Bumpy was only 27 years old, young by Underworld standards, still learning the rules, still proving himself. Across town, the man who wanted him dead was already a legend. Dutch Schultz, a name that carried weight, a man who had built an empire during Prohibition and wasn't ready to give up power just because the laws were changing. Schultz didn't like resistance. He didn't like being told no. And he especially didn't like it when that word came from Harlem. Harlem in 1933 was no longer the glittering symbol people romanticize today. The Renaissance had faded. The Great Depression had hit hard. Jobs were scarce, money was scarce, and hope was even scarcer. But there was one thing that never stopped moving: the numbers game. A simple illegal lottery that let people dream bigger than their pockets allowed. For a few cents, someone struggling to survive could imagine a different life, even if only for a moment. That hope made Harlem valuable. And Dutch Schultz saw value better than most. To Schultz, Harlem wasn't community. It was an opportunity. Millions of dollars flowing through back pockets and brown paper bags. Money that wasn't protected by banks or laws, only by people. And Schultz believed people could be broken. But Harlem already had its own system, its own power. At the center of it stood Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the undisputed queen of the numbers game. And standing beside her was Bumpy Johnson, not just muscle, not just an enforcer, but something different. Someone who understood that control didn't come only from fear. It came from loyalty, from respect, from knowing when not to pull the trigger. Bumpy had grown up fighting, first in the South, then in Harlem, then inside prison walls where he educated himself while others hardened. He read, he observed, he learned people, and when he came back to the streets, he carried himself like someone who didn't need to shout to be heard. When Schultz sent his men to Harlem to negotiate, it wasn't really a negotiation. It was a demand. Pay up, fall in line, or disappear. Madame St. Clair refused, and that refusal was something Schultz could not forgive. So he made a decision. If Harlem wouldn't bend, it would break. And the first crack would be Bumpy Johnson. Not quietly, not privately. Schultz wanted an ending that everyone would hear about, a message written in blood, meant to echo through the streets and scare anyone who thought resistance was possible. That's how Bumpy found himself heading toward the Cotton Club basement before dawn. Alone, as far as anyone knew. Maybe it was a mistake. Or maybe Bumpy understood exactly what kind of night it was going to be. The basement wasn't glamorous. Just a low ceiling, stacked crates, old tables, and one narrow way in and out. The kind of place where sound carried and secrets stayed buried. When Bumpy stepped down those stairs, the air was heavy, quiet in a way that makes your instincts speak louder than your ears. Then the silence broke. Men stepped out from the shadows. 12 of them. Schultz's best. The kind of men whose names rarely made it into police files. Faces hardened by experience. Hands already steady on weapons. This wasn't a conversation. It was an ending. Bumpy didn't run. He didn't raise his hands. He just looked at them, counted, calmly, as if he was the one measuring the room. That moment, the pause before everything changed, is what people still talk about, because men in that position usually beg, or panic, or lash out. Bumpy didn't do any of that. He spoke like someone who wasn't surprised, like someone who had already imagined this outcome and prepared for it. What happened next has been argued about for decades. Stories change depending on who told them. Some say it was chaos. Some say it was strategy. Some say luck played a role. What everyone agrees on is this. When the door finally opened and the lights came back on, The situation was nothing like what Schultz had planned. Bumpy Johnson was gone, and only one of Schultz's men was still able to walk. That man carried more than injuries. He carried a message. Hours later, as the city fully woke up, that message reached Dutch Schultz himself, delivered not with shouting or threats, but with something quieter, something colder, something that made even a man like Schultz stop and think. For the first time in a long time, Dutch Schultz didn't respond with violence. He didn't send more men. He didn't retaliate the way everyone expected. Instead, he pulled back from Harlem, from the fight, from a war he suddenly understood would cost more than it was worth. Why? Because Bumpy Johnson had done something rare. He didn't just survive. He changed the balance. He proved that power doesn't always belong to the man with the most guns. Sometimes it belongs to the man who understands people, timing, and fear better than anyone else in the room. But here's the part that still isn't clear. Did Bumpy really walk into that basement alone? Was it all instinct? Or was everything already in place before the first step down the stairs? That's where the legend begins. And that's where the truth gets complicated. Because what happened in that basement didn't just save Bumpy Johnson's life. It made him untouchable. And in the next part, we're breaking down exactly how it happened. And why Dutch Schultz never tried again. Alone wasn't enough. Life there was unforgiving. Rules were uneven. Respect wasn't offered freely. You either learned how to read people or you paid for it. When Bumpy arrived in Harlem as a teenager, the neighborhood was alive in a way few places were. Music spilled out of clubs. Ideas flowed through cafes and street corners. But underneath the beauty was pressure. Too many people chasing too few opportunities. Harlem rewarded those who could adapt, who could see patterns before others did. Bumpy watched. He listened. He learned who mattered and who didn't. He learned when silence spoke louder than words. By the time he crossed paths with Madame St. Clair, he had already built a reputation, not for cruelty, but for consistency. If he gave his word, it held. If he stepped in, problems ended. People felt protected around him, and that kind of trust was rare. It's also what made him dangerous to outsiders. You can intimidate individuals, but intimidating a community is a different thing entirely. Dutch Schultz didn't see that. He saw numbers on paper. He saw territory. To him, Harlem was just another piece on the board. He had spent years forcing his way into industries that didn't want him, using pressure until resistance collapsed. That approach had always worked before. So when his emissaries came back embarrassed, brushed off, and quietly threatened by a man who barely said a word, Schultz took it personally. That was his first mistake. The second mistake was assuming fear worked the same way everywhere. In Harlem, fear had been a constant companion for generations. It didn't automatically translate into obedience. Sometimes it did the opposite. Sometimes it sharpened resolve. In the days leading up to Valentine's Day, something felt off to those paying attention. Runners whispered about unfamiliar faces. People noticed cars idling too long on corners. The air felt tight, like a storm waiting to break. Bumpy noticed too. He always did. But instead of retreating, he leaned in, not recklessly, deliberately. That's what made his decision to go alone feel so confusing to outsiders. Why walk into uncertainty without backup? Why place yourself in a position where one wrong move could end everything? The truth is, Bumpy understood something many didn't. Control doesn't always come from numbers. Sometimes it comes from timing, from letting your opponent believe they're ahead. The Cotton Club basement wasn't chosen at random. It was a place tied to Harlem's rhythm, familiar enough to feel safe, forgotten enough to feel invisible. Bumpy had been there countless times. He knew how sound traveled. He knew where people stood when they were nervous. He knew how quickly confidence could disappear once the lights changed. What Dutch's men didn't realize was that Bumpy wasn't reacting in that room. He was executing a plan that had started long before he reached the stairs. Every pause, every word, every glance was intentional, not to intimidate, but to unsettle, to create doubt. And doubt, in moments like that, spreads faster than panic. Afterward, people tried to piece the night together like a puzzle missing half its pieces. Some swore they heard shouting. Others said there was nothing but silence. The stories conflicted, overlapped, contradicted each other, and that uncertainty only added to the myth. When facts are scarce, imagination fills the gaps. What everyone agreed on was the aftermath. Dutch Schultz didn't retaliate. He didn't escalate. For a man known for extreme responses, that silence was louder than any threat. It sent a signal through the underworld that something had shifted, that there were limits, even for men like him. Bumpy didn't celebrate. He didn't make speeches. He didn't announce victories. He went back to work the next day like nothing had happened. That, more than anything, unsettled people. Victory usually changes men. Power often demands recognition. Bumpy treated it like responsibility instead. Behind the scenes, Harlem watched closely. People wanted to know what this meant. Would peace last? Was this just a pause before something worse? Bumpy never offered answers. He kept meetings short, listened more than he spoke, made sure businesses ran smoothly, made sure people felt safe. That quiet stability spoke volumes. But unanswered questions lingered. Was the survivor spared by chance or design? Was the message planned in advance or decided in the moment? And most importantly, was Dutch Schultz truly finished with Harlem, or was he simply waiting? Those closest to Bumpy noticed subtle changes. He trusted fewer people, asked sharper questions, paid attention to details others ignored. He knew that moments like this didn't end conflicts. They transformed them. When power shifts, it creates ripples, some visible, others hidden beneath the surface. And somewhere beyond Harlem, Dutch Schultz was still alive, still thinking, still calculating. A man like that doesn't forget humiliation easily. He doesn't forget the feeling of being outplayed. Even if he walked away, the memory lingered. That tension sat heavy in the air, unspoken, unresolved, because the night in the basement wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new one. And the question everyone was afraid to ask was simple. When two powerful men test each other and neither backs down completely, how long can silence really last? The days after that night didn't bring relief. They brought silence. And in Harlem, silence was never comforting. It was a kind that made people listen harder, watch longer, and question every unfamiliar face. The streets moved as usual, but underneath, something had shifted. People felt it even if they couldn't explain it. Bumpy Johnson understood that silence better than anyone. He knew it wasn't peace. It was assessment. Everyone was measuring him now. Friends, rivals, police, and men who had never spoken his name out loud before. He didn't rush to fill the quiet. He let it breathe. Power, he believed, revealed itself when you didn't force it. Madame St. Clair watched him closely. She trusted Bumpy, but she also knew how quickly loyalty could turn into liability. The numbers game depended on order. Any instability could send people running or invite unwanted attention. She began tightening operations, changing routines, shifting meeting places. Not out of fear, but caution. Harlem had survived because it adapted, not because it stood still. From her perspective, the conflict wasn't just about Dutch Schultz. It was about what came next. White syndicates were watching. Italian families were watching. They all wanted to know if Harlem could protect its own without collapsing under pressure. If Bumpy failed, it wouldn't just be his fall. It would open the door for outsiders to carve the neighborhood apart. Bumpy felt that weight. He carried it quietly. He started spending more time walking the streets alone, stopping to talk to shop owners, listening to runners, noticing which corners felt uneasy. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was mapping the mood. Fear showed itself in small ways. People leaving earlier, doors locking faster, conversations ending mid-sentence. He made mental notes of everything. Meanwhile, Dutch Schultz's world didn't move on as smoothly as people assumed. On the surface, it looked like he had accepted the outcome. His operations continued elsewhere. His men stayed busy. But inside his circle, questions began to surface. Not spoken loudly, but whispered. Why Harlem? Why back down? For men used to dominance, retreat felt unfamiliar and uncomfortable. Some of Schultz's lieutenants believed it was temporary, a pause to regroup. Others worried something deeper had changed. They had seen the look on Schultz's face that morning. Not anger, not rage. Something closer to calculation, mixed with uncertainty. That unsettled them more than any outburst ever could. The survivor from the basement became a shadow. People avoided him, not because he talked too much, but because he didn't talk at all. Whatever he had seen stayed locked behind his eyes. That kind of silence spreads unease. It turns a man into a reminder. And reminders are dangerous. Rumors began to travel. Some said Bumpy had helped that night. Others said it was instinct. A few claimed it was luck. None of the stories matched, and that inconsistency worked in Bumpy's favor. Uncertainty made him harder to predict, harder to challenge. Legends grow fastest where facts are thin. Law enforcement took notice too. Not officially, not on paper, but through glances and casual questions. A sudden absence of violence often attracted more attention than chaos. Detectives started showing up more often in Harlem, pretending to look for unrelated issues. They watched Bumpy from across the street, trying to decide if he was worth the effort. For now, he kept his profile low enough to avoid provoking them. Inside Harlem, younger men looked at Bumpy differently now. Some with admiration, some with ambition. Power creates gravity. It pulls people in, but it also attracts those who want to test it. Bumpy knew that internal threats could be just as dangerous as outside ones. He paid close attention to who suddenly spoke more, who spoke less, and who seemed too eager to impress. At night, alone, he replayed the moments leading up to the basement, not with regret, but with analysis. He believed survival demanded constant review. He asked himself what could have gone wrong, what signals he might have missed, what assumptions he'd made. Confidence without reflection, he knew, was just arrogance waiting for consequences. The community saw only the surface. A man who stood firm, a leader who didn't panic. But beneath that calm was constant motion. Decisions layered on top of each other. Choices that balanced pride against protection. Harlem wasn't just territory. It was people, families, dreams held together by fragile routines. Across the city, Dutch Schultz sat in rooms filled with smoke and numbers, listening more than he spoke. He let others argue possibilities. Retaliation, negotiation, forgetting Harlem altogether. He didn't correct them. He wanted to hear what they believed. Men reveal themselves when they think they're advising power instead of being watched by it. In private moments, Schultz replayed the message delivered to him, not the words, but the meaning behind them. He recognized intelligence when he encountered it, and intelligence unsettled him. Brute force was predictable. Strategy was not. Bumpy Johnson hadn't just survived. He had communicated something without saying much at all. That understanding created an uncomfortable truth. Even if Schultz returned to Harlem with more men, the outcome wouldn't be guaranteed. And uncertainty was expensive. It drained resources, loyalty, and reputation. Walking away might have looked like weakness, but miscalculating would have looked worse. The city itself seemed to hold its breath. Every major shift in power creates a moment where the future is undecided. Harlem was in that moment now. Balance between stability and chaos. Between protection and invasion. Bumpy felt it every time he stepped outside. Eyes followed him, not with fear but expectation. People wanted reassurance without him saying a word. He gave it by continuing to show up, continuing to listen, continuing to move carefully. But tension doesn't disappear just because no one speaks it aloud. It waits. And somewhere between Harlem's quiet corners and Dutch Schultz's calculating silence, a question hung unanswered. Was this restraint? Or was it just a calm before something much bigger began? As winter slowly gave way to early spring, the city didn't relax. It tightened. Harlem looked the same on the surface, but beneath it, everything felt wound too tightly, like a clock pulled past its limit. People sensed that the pause wouldn't last forever. Power never stayed still for long. It either settled into something permanent or exploded into something uncontrollable. Bumpy Johnson felt that pressure every day. The respect he'd earned after the basement incident came with expectations he couldn't ignore. People assumed he had answers, that he had plans, that he could see further ahead than anyone else. The truth was, he saw risks everywhere. Too many eyes, too many opinions, too many people trying to guess his next move. He began receiving quiet warnings from different corners. A bartender mentioned unfamiliar men asking questions. A runner said someone had followed him for 2 blocks before disappearing. A club owner swore he recognized a face from the Bronx in a place it didn't belong. None of it was proof. All of it was signal. Someone, somewhere was testing the edges. Madame St. Clair urged caution. She had survived long enough to know that victories often invited retaliation disguised as patience. She reminded Bumpy that pride could undo even the smartest man. Harlem didn't need a hero right now, she said. It needed stability. Bumpy listened, but he also knew stability didn't come from pretending danger wasn't real. Inside his own circle, tension crept in. Some of his men wanted to strike first, convinced that Dutch Schultz was only waiting for the right moment. Others argued that escalation would bring unwanted attention from law enforcement and rival syndicates. The disagreement wasn't loud, but it was constant. Every decision felt heavier than the last. Bumpy noticed how conversations changed when he entered a room, how laughter stopped too quickly, how people waited for his reaction before forming their own. Power does that. It separates you even from those closest to you. He made an effort to keep things normal, but normal was slipping away. Across the city, Dutch Schultz continued to gather information without making moves. He met with men who knew Harlem, but weren't connected to it. He asked about routines, personalities, loyalties. Not aggressively. Casually. The way a man asks questions when he's already forming an answer in his head. To those around him, Schultz appeared calm, focused on other ventures. But calm didn't mean settled. It meant deliberate. He had built his reputation by choosing the moment, not by rushing into it. And the humiliation he'd suffered hadn't faded. It had matured. The Underworld whispered. Some said Schultz was done with Harlem for good. Others believed he was planning something quieter, something less obvious, a move that wouldn't look like retaliation, but would shift control just the same. The uncertainty fed anxiety. When no one knows where the blow will land, everyone braces. Law enforcement pressure increased subtly. Patrols lingered longer. Questions became more pointed. Bumpy understood the pattern. Conflict attracts attention. Attention invites intervention. And intervention rarely helped the people who lived there. He adjusted routes, changed habits, limited exposure. Every step was calculated. One evening, as Bumpy walked past a familiar corner, he noticed something small but wrong. A routine that had shifted. A face that should have been there wasn't. That absence spoke louder than presence. It told him someone had moved pieces on the board without announcing it. He didn't confront it. He filed it away. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Not from fear, but from anticipation. Moments like this had a particular feeling. A tightening in the chest. A sense that events were aligning whether you were ready or not. Bumpy had felt it before. In prison. On the streets. Before fights that changed everything. The next few days confirmed it. Meetings fell through without explanation. Messages arrived late, or not at all. Someone was interfering. Quietly enough to avoid detection, but clearly enough to be felt. Harlem's rhythm was being disrupted from the inside. Bumpy began to suspect that the next move wouldn't look like violence. It would look like confusion, division, pressure applied in places that didn't draw headlines. That realization worried him more than any direct threat. You could prepare for force. Subtlety required anticipation. Madame St. Clair sensed it too. She tightened control further, but the cost was rising. People grew nervous when systems changed too often. Trust frayed at the edges. And fear, when left unchecked, could spread faster than any rumor. Meanwhile, Dutch Schultz received word that Harlem wasn't as unified as it appeared. That cracks were forming. That patience was working. The information pleased him, but it didn't satisfy him. He wanted certainty. He wanted to know whether Bumpy Johnson was reacting or simply waiting. The survivor from the basement resurfaced briefly in conversation, then disappeared again. No one knew where he was. Some said Schultz had sent him away. Others believed he'd gone on his own. His absence added to the unease. Loose ends always do. Bumpy began preparing for a moment he couldn't yet see clearly. He didn't know where it would happen or how it would begin, only that it was coming. He met privately with people he trusted most, not to plan an attack, but to reinforce lines of communication, to ensure that when something shifted, it wouldn't catch them blind. Every choice now carried consequences beyond Harlem. Other syndicates were watching closely. If Bumpy faltered, they would move. If Schultz overreached, they would take advantage. The balance was delicate, and everyone knew it. One afternoon, a message reached Bumpy through an indirect channel. Short, vague, not a threat, not an offer. Just enough to confirm his suspicion. The pause was ending. That evening, Harlem felt different. Quieter, like the city itself was listening. Bumpy stood at his office window, looking out at the streets he'd sworn to protect. He understood then that whatever came next would define more than just his own fate. It would decide who truly controlled Harlem, and how. Somewhere across the city, Dutch Schultz reached a similar conclusion. Two men, two strategies, one inevitable collision. And as night fell, the tension tightened to its breaking point, leaving only one unanswered question hanging in the air. When the moment finally arrived, who would move first? The moment didn't arrive with noise. It arrived with absence. One morning, Bumpy was told that one of Madame St. Clair's most reliable runners hadn't shown up. No message, no explanation, just gone. At first, it didn't seem alarming. People disappeared for all kinds of reasons in Harlem. But then another runner failed to report. Then a third, all from different areas. All trusted, all careful men. That was when Bumpy understood this wasn't pressure from the outside. This was something more calculated. Someone wasn't attacking Harlem head-on. They were draining it quietly, removing key pieces without leaving fingerprints. No threats, no visible force. Just disruption. The kind that made people doubt the system itself. Rumors spread fast. Some said the missing men had been paid off. Others believed they'd been scared into hiding. A few whispered something worse. The uncertainty did exactly what it was meant to do. It weakened confidence. And confidence was the foundation of everything. Bumpy didn't react publicly. He didn't send men rushing through the streets. Instead, he started asking questions in places no one expected. He spoke to family members, to bartenders, to musicians who played late, and noticed who came and went. Slowly, a pattern began to form. The missing runners hadn't vanished randomly. Each one had recently been approached by strangers offering protection, not threats, opportunities. Promises of stability if things in Harlem became unpredictable. The offers were subtle enough to sound reasonable. That was the dangerous part. It wasn't Dutch Schultz showing his hand directly. It was influence moving ahead of him, softening the ground, making people question whether Bumpy Johnson could really keep them safe if the pressure returned. That realization hit harder than any open challenge. Inside Bumpy's circle, tensions rose sharply. Some of his men felt betrayed. Others felt exposed. A few began to wonder, quietly, if aligning elsewhere might be safer. Bumpy could sense a shift. Loyalty doesn't break all at once. It frays. Madame St. Clair confronted him privately. Her concern wasn't anger. It was urgency. If the numbers operation looked unstable, people would stop playing. If people stopped playing, Harlem's economy would collapse from the inside. That was the real threat, not violence. Erosion. Across the city, Dutch Schultz listened to reports with measured satisfaction. This was the strategy he trusted most. No headlines, no sudden moves, just patience and persuasion. If Harlem weakened itself, he wouldn't need to step in forcefully at all. He could arrive later, invited rather than resisted. But even Schultz knew this approach carried risk. Too much pressure too soon could expose a plan. Too little would give Bumpy time to counter it. Timing mattered. And Bumpy Johnson was not a man who missed patterns for long. The second twist came unexpectedly. One of the missing runners came back. He showed up late one night, nervous, exhausted, and clearly shaken. He didn't speak openly. Not at first. But what he eventually shared changed everything. The offers hadn't just come from Schultz's people. They'd come through intermediaries. Faces Harlem recognized. Names that shouldn't have been involved. That meant the problem wasn't only outside influence. It was internal. Bumpy felt the weight of that truth settle heavily. An external enemy could be confronted. Internal doubt was harder. It hid behind smiles and familiar voices. And once it spread, it was almost impossible to contain. He realized then that the next confrontation wouldn't look like a showdown. It would look like choices. Who stayed loyal, who hesitated, who waited to see which way the wind blew. Harlem was being forced to decide without being told it was a decision at all. Bumpy adjusted again. He stopped trying to control everything directly. Instead, he watched, let people reveal themselves. In moments of pressure, truth surfaced naturally. Who asked too many questions? Who suddenly avoided eye contact? Who spoke about options instead of solutions? At the same time, law enforcement attention intensified. Anonymous tips had started circulating. Nothing concrete, just enough to increase scrutiny. That wasn't an accident either. Pressure from above and below. A classic squeeze. Dutch Schultz was pleased, but not relaxed. He knew Bumpy was still standing, still thinking. And men like Bumpy didn't fall quietly. They adapted. Somewhere in the middle of all this, a message reached Bumpy through an old, trusted channel. Not a threat, not an offer, a warning. The ground was shifting faster than he realized. That night, Bumpy stood alone again, staring out of Harlem, but this time the threat wasn't waiting in shadows or basements. It was woven into conversations, decisions, and doubts. Harder to see, harder to fight. The conflict had evolved. It was no longer about whether Dutch Schultz would return to Harlem. It was about whether Harlem would still be standing as one when he did. And as the pressure tightened from every side, one truth became impossible to ignore. The next move wouldn't just decide a winner. It would expose who truly belonged on either side of power. The breaking point came quietly, the way all real turning points do, not with sirens or shouting, but with certainty. Bumpy Johnson woke up one morning knowing the waiting was over. The pattern was complete now. The missing runners, the quiet offers, the internal doubt, the increased attention from law enforcement. It all pointed to one truth. Dutch Schultz hadn't changed his mind about Harlem. He had changed his method. Instead of forcing his way in, Schultz had tried to make Harlem invite him. That realization sharpened everything. Bumpy didn't call a meeting. He didn't send warnings. He did something far more dangerous. He made himself visible. He walked Harlem openly, spoke with shop owners, greeted runners, stood in familiar doorways where everyone could see him. It wasn't bravado. It was reassurance, a reminder that he was still there, still watching, still in control. At the same time, Madame St. Clair made her move, quietly, decisively. She tightened the numbers operation overnight, replacing compromised routes, cutting off anyone whose loyalty wavered. It wasn't punishment. It was clarity. People suddenly understood that hesitation had consequences, and certainty began to return. Dutch Schultz received reports that unsettled him. The erosion he'd counted on was slowing. Confidence was rebuilding. Harlem wasn't fracturing the way it should have. Worse, the intermediaries he relied on were starting to pull back, afraid of being exposed. The plan was slipping. Schultz decided then that subtlety had reached its limit. He sent word, not a threat, not an apology, but an invitation. A neutral sit-down, away from Harlem, away from witnesses. A conversation, he said, between businessmen who understood reality. Many advised Bumpy not to go. Some saw it as a trap. Others believed refusing would signal weakness. Bumpy went. The meeting place was quiet, chosen carefully. No raised voices. No obvious tension. Just two men sitting across from each other, each fully aware of what the other represented. Schultz spoke first, calmly outlining his position. Harlem was expensive to protect, he said. Pressure would keep coming. From syndicates, from law enforcement, from the city itself. Alignment, he suggested, was a practical solution. Bumpy listened without interrupting. When Schultz finished, Bumpy responded simply. Harlem wasn't a market to be managed. It was a community. And communities, he said, don't respond well to ownership. Schultz studied him, searching for cracks. He saw none. That was the moment Schultz understood the truth he'd been avoiding. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a man guarding territory. He was the territory. His power didn't come from fear or money alone. It came from belonging, and that made him far harder to remove. The conversation ended without agreement, but something shifted. Schultz didn't threaten him. He didn't push further. He walked away knowing that forcing the issue now would cost more than it would ever return. Within weeks, the pressure eased. The offers stopped. The intermediaries disappeared. Law enforcement attention drifted elsewhere, not because Schultz had surrendered publicly, but because he had recalculated privately. Harlem, he decided, wasn't worth the war would take to control it. Bumpy returned to Harlem without announcing anything. Life resumed its rhythm. The numbers game stabilized. Runners returned. Confidence restored itself slowly, cautiously, but fully. To the outside world, it looked like nothing had happened. But here's the twist few ever saw coming. Years later, long after Dutch Schultz was gone, a quiet detail surfaced through those who had lived close to the events. The subtle sabotage that nearly fractured Harlem. The offers, the internal doubt, the erosion, hadn't started with Schultz's men. It had started earlier, from within Harlem itself. Before Schultz ever shifted strategies, before the pause ended, a small group inside the operation had already begun questioning Bumpy's control. Schultz hadn't created the cracks. He had simply found them and widened them. And Bumpy had known, much earlier than anyone realized. He had let the test play out on purpose. By allowing doubt to surface, by letting people choose sides under pressure, Bumpy identified weaknesses that no show of force ever could. When the moment came, he didn't just defend Harlem from Schultz. He strengthened it against future threats. That was the part history rarely mentioned. Bumpy Johnson didn't just win a conflict. He reshaped the balance of power without ever declaring war. And that's why Harlem remained his. Not because no one challenged him, but because everyone who did learned the same lesson. Some power can be taken. Other power has to be accepted. And Bumpy Johnson had become impossible to remove. Not through fear, but through understanding exactly how pressure breaks men and how patience breaks plans. The night in the basement made him untouchable. What followed proved why. After the pressure faded and the streets settled back into their familiar rhythm, Harlem slowly exhaled. Not all at once, and not without caution, but enough for people to believe the worst had passed. Shops stayed open later again. Music lingered longer in the clubs. Conversation stopped dropping into whispers every time a stranger walked by. The neighborhood didn't celebrate a victory, because no one had announced one. It simply continued, and in Harlem, continuation itself was success. Bumpy Johnson returned to what he had always done best, maintaining balance. He didn't expand aggressively. He didn't chase power beyond what already existed. That restraint surprised many outsiders. They expected a man who would stare down Dutch Schultz to grow reckless with confidence. Instead, Bumpy became more measured, more deliberate. He understood something few did. Winning once didn't guarantee survival tomorrow. Madame St. Clair remained at the center of the numbers operation, but her role shifted subtly. She trusted Bumpy's judgment more than ever. Yet she also understood the value of distance. Too much visibility attracted the wrong kind of attention. Together, they adjusted the system, making it quieter, more efficient, harder to disrupt. It wasn't about maximizing profit anymore. It was about protecting the people who depended on it. The runners who had disappeared were slowly accounted for. Some returned ashamed but relieved. Others never came back, choosing safer lives away from the tension. Bumpy didn't punish those who left. He believed fear-driven loyalty was worthless. What mattered was who stayed. When leaving was easier, law enforcement eventually moved on to other targets. Without open conflict or obvious disruptions, Harlem became less urgent to them. That didn't mean it was invisible. It meant it had learned how to survive under observation. A lesson Bumpy never forgot. As for Dutch Schultz, His decision proved to be final. Harlem never saw his men return in force. He shifted focus elsewhere, chasing opportunities that didn't require fighting an entire community. Those who knew him understood what that choice truly meant. It wasn't mercy. It was respect mixed with realism. Schultz had recognized the battle. He could win cleanly, and that recognition saved him from a war that would have drained everything he had built. Years later, people would still argue about who really won. Some said Bumpy forced Schultz out. Others claimed Schultz simply lost interest. The truth lived somewhere in between. Power isn't always about domination. Sometimes it's about knowing when resistance is too costly. Bumpy never corrected the stories. He allowed myths to exist alongside facts. He knew legends protected him as much as reality did. The uncertainty surrounding that night in the basement, the quiet war that followed, and the way it all ended without bloodshed became part of Harlem's collective memory. What mattered more than the details was the outcome. Harlem remained in Harlem's hands. As time passed, Bumpy Johnson's reputation grew beyond the streets. Writers, reporters, and outsiders tried to define him. Some called him a criminal. Others called him a protector. He never accepted either label fully. He saw himself as a man doing what the situation demanded, making choices in a world that rarely offered good ones. He continued to walk the neighborhood. Even as age slowed him, he still listened more than he spoke, still noticed the small shifts others ignored, still believed that respect wasn't taken by force, but maintained through consistency. People trusted him because he had proven, again and again, that he understood consequences. The biggest lesson of the conflict wasn't about violence or strategy. It was about patience. Dutch Schultz had tried to rush control and failed. Bumpy Johnson had waited, watched, and let pressure reveal truth. In doing so, he protected Harlem not just from one man, but from the pattern that always followed power struggles. Looking back, it became clear that the night in the basement wasn't the most important moment. It was just the spark. What truly mattered was what came after. The restraint, the choices made when no one was watching, the understanding that survival required more than strength. It required judgment. Harlem remembered that. Decades later, people still spoke about Bumpy Johnson with a mix of awe and familiarity, not as a distant legend, but as someone who belonged to the streets he protected. His story endured because it wasn't just about crime or conflict. It was about community standing its ground in a city that constantly tried to reshape it. The lesson lingered quietly, passed down in conversations and cautionary tales. Power built on fear eventually collapses. Power built on trust endures. Bumpy Johnson understood that better than most, and that is why, long after the names of his rivals faded, Harlem still remembered the man who chose patience over chaos and kept his neighborhood standing when the pressure came from every side.